Nancy Twana, director of the Rock Ethics Institute, and this has been a good series. Been very little leaves her speechless, but this talk has, apparently, because she's lost her voice with laryngitis. So I want to welcome everybody to this next but last talk in the Health as a Human Right series of the Rock Ethics Institute this year, and to remind you that another really good talk will be coming up in the final one on April 10th, when Helen Epstein, a writer and independent consultant, will talk about why are HIV rates so high in Africa, and what does this have to do with human rights. The series for this year for the Rock Ethics Institute, Health as a Human Right, is about ethical implications to the right to health, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, perhaps one could call it, equal access to adequate health care, public health and the effect of poverty on health, and the causes of health disparities on both nationally and internationally. And it's drawn widespread, the series has drawn widespread support from Penn State entities, and I need to acknowledge the support for this series. This includes Richard and Ronnie Lippin, the Arthur W. Page Center for Integrity and Public Communication, the Center for Healthcare and Policy Research, Center for Human Development and Family Research in Diverse Contexts, Children, Youth, and Families Consortium, Department of Biobehavioral Health, Department of Health Policy and Administration, Department of Sociology, our Gerontology Center, the Penn State College of Medicine's Department of Humanities. Somebody wants you to come. Pre-medicine program, School of Nursing, and the University Libraries. And overall, both the Institute itself and the series of the Rock Ethics Institute are made possible with the support of a generous gift from Doug and Julie Rock. Our speaker today, Ophelia Dahl, is executive director of an organization called Partners in Health, which is a nonprofit healthcare organization dedicated to combating major medical problems in the most needy and underserved populations around the entire world. Her commitment to delivering health care where it's most needed began when, although she grew up as a child of privilege, for some reason, strange reason, she decided to seek the meaning of life or something, and decided to go to impoverished central Haiti in 1983 as an 18-year-old to volunteer her services in a small clinic called I Care Haiti. And she never looked back. She there met in Haiti Paul Farmer and has worked closely with him ever since. And they founded Partners in Health in 1987, which began its work in rural Haiti, but now delivers health care on many continents and addresses health inequities and social injustice around the world. Ophelia Dahl, Paul Farmer, and Partners in Health were the subject of the best-selling book called Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder, published in 2004, which I'm sure you've read, and those of you who have not read it, you really should. You will really like this book. Ms. Dahl is a graduate of Wellesley College, and she's a writer herself. She serves on the board of her family's foundation that honors the work of her father, the late writer Roald Dahl, upon whose work all of you probably grew up. And she almost promises that she's writing a book about him. And she's engaged in philanthropic works in the United States and native England. So please welcome me in joining Ophelia Dahl.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of the Rock Ethics Institute Health as a Human Right lecture series. How good that sounds, health as a human right. I believe it was Martin Luther King who said that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. You don't have to go to Africa or Haiti to see why this is still true, perhaps even more shocking now than when Dr. King said this. I have a feeling that if Martin Luther King were alive today, he would be deeply troubled by the awful state of human rights and the free-range injustices which seem to go almost unchallenged in much of the world. He would no doubt be pleased by the gains and changes resulting from the long struggle waged for civil rights in this country, but I can't help but think he would be disheartened to know about the conditions in which so many people in this world are forced to live without access to the most basic fruits of modern medicine. When I was working on this talk in Rwanda last week, where we've just started a project of Partners in Health, there was something about being in Africa at the dawn of a new project for us, and it reminded me of PIH's beginnings. So I hope you don't mind if this is more of a personal talk than I usually give. There's something intimate about being at a university with 42,000 students. But I believe I've been invited to talk to you, as Ken earlier said, because in the early 80s I helped to found a small organization called Partners in Health. This came about after I'd spent some time volunteering with a non-governmental organization in Haiti, living in an orphanage in Port-au-Prince. About the same time, I met a fellow called Paul Farmer, who was taking a year to work in Haiti before going to medical school. Some of you might have read about him in Tracy Kidder's book. But it was a fortuitous meeting for me. It was one that produced the right kind of chemistry. And although I didn't know it at the time, it was a meeting that would determine what I would do with the rest of my life. So let me tell you a little bit about Partners in Health and how I got there. Broadly, Partners in Health's mission is to address inequalities in access to healthcare in several settings around the world. Running an organization devoted to the health of poor people is not what I thought I'd be doing with my life. It's certainly not what I set out to do. But the summer I turned 18, I was actually preparing to go to drama school, of all things, in London, and it had been a plan of mine for years. I'd always thought that this would be my route, and if I was lucky enough to be able to work in the theatre in London. Not a bad thing to do if that's your calling. However, as often happens when plans are laid, I took what I thought ended on the other side of the world, a world apart from mine. Until then, most of my life had been spent in pretty idyllic setting in England with sparky, entertaining parents. My father had often spoken to me about his own adventurous life during the time before he had children. His craving for adventure propelled him away from England, first to Newfoundland, and then to East Africa, where he stayed until the outbreak of World War II. And then he joined the RAF, learning how to fly, actually in Iraq, of all places. He led a life so filled with interesting exploration that it seemed to me at times as though he had been born at the cusp of something important, a time when so much was happening. The war he fought in World War II was easy to believe in. Almost all of us would have signed up against an enemy bent on genocide. It was a time that I've fully romanticized, the dawn of modern medicine and antibiotics. Cars and aeroplanes were relatively new, which meant that the world was still a huge and somewhat unexplored place. For me and for my generation, the potential for living in such exciting times seemed pale in comparison. I had no idea what a spectacular array of opportunities lay just under the surface. And I learned from my dad that the secret to a fulfilling life has very little to do with the timing of one's birth. But I still wanted him to approve of my choice. So as soon as I finished high school, thinking that it would impress him, I announced quite out of the blue and without any sort of a plan that I was going to go away and volunteer abroad. I had no idea where I might go. But after writing a letter to an organization based in DC, one that funds health projects in developing countries, I ended up in Haiti, a place so foreign to me I had to look it up in an encyclopedia. But that is exactly where I got off the plane on a steamy evening in January of 1983, aged 18. I remember driving away from the airport into the grimy city, my nostrils filled with new smells, and my eyes taking in every person and straggly dog along the roadside. Haiti was startling for many reasons, not just because I had come from a temperate English village, but because it challenged everything I thought I knew about the order of things. I lived for several months in a school for handicapped children, run by an American nun, and I helped as best as anyone could with no formal training whatsoever. The place was packed with children who'd been made handicapped by polio, or were blind, or deaf, or badly injured through traumatic, unattended births. And later, because I wanted to see more of Haiti, I joined an ophthalmic organization whose mission was to take care of patients with glaucoma and to staff outreach clinics in rural areas. I knew that I had nothing much to offer except energy and goodwill, and yet I was getting trained in something. It was subtle, perhaps, and it had more to do with the fact that I was taking everything in. Things that leave an indelible mark on you. I watched as old women, their eyes milky from cataracts or bulging from glaucoma, came to the clinics, clutching a filthy old rag, and inside a few coins to try to pay for their care. I watched carefully as parents tried to talk their way into clinics with desperately sick children, and I didn't stop watching when I saw them turned away for their inability to pay. What I realized I was seeing for the first time was a new level of suffering, and it seemed to me as though much of it was about a lack of access to resources. And that produced a pattern that won't surprise any of you. No land, no food, no education, no health, no life. This was my initiation to life outside Europe, and for me, in spite of what I thought was my worldliness, it was my introduction to abject poverty, and with it came a new feeling of helplessness. I came across a number of excellent and interesting people during my first 6 months in Haiti, people that made an impression for good or bad reasons. Coming from England, you'd think I would have been all over the subtleties of class and its ramifications, but Haiti took this to a new and stupefying level. I remember accompanying an old woman who had had a stroke in the village in which I was working to a neurologist in Port-au-Prince. She, being a peasant without much education, spoke only Haitian. The neurologist, in a modern, swanky office in Port-au-Prince, absolutely could speak Creole. But he also spoke the language of the educated classes in Haiti, and that is French. He examined her and spoke only in French, and when she told him she didn't understand what he was saying, he refused to switch to Creole and carried on talking as though she wasn't there and she didn't matter. So imagine you visit a doctor, say at one of the large teaching hospitals around here, with a serious neurological complaint, one that has robbed you of much of your gross motor function, and the doctor you seek out starts to speak to you in Esperanto. Certain neurological disorders are also called insults in the medical world, and for good reason. It occurred to me then that the lives of many in Haiti, already difficult, consist of insult upon insult. The patient, Madame Herman, turned to us humiliated, and we translated the French into Haitian Creole, and the doctor paused unperturbed while we decoded his language for her, as if this was the natural order of things. So this made an impression. How could it not? How we translate the world and all around us surely determines what we do with our lives, and must surely help to define what our calling is. I remember thinking as I walked around Haiti as a young person, there are so many problems and they seem so deep, so embedded in the fabric of the country, I wondered how it would be possible to make a dent in anything. And it was Paul Farmer, the fellow to whom Ken was referring, who said to me, let's do just one thing. Listen to the community and ask them what they want. Some of us, if we are lucky, can recall a moment in our lives when something altered, clicked into place, even though we may not have recognized it at the time. I happen to remember it vividly, even though it was a long time ago. I was with Paul in the car high above the hills in Port-au-Prince, about to leave Haiti to go back to England after my first visit. I'd seen a lot. In the midst of a long discussion, he pointed through the bougainvillea to a large slum on the edge of Port-au-Prince, a slum so sprawling and close to the sea that it looked as though it could have been part of the geological structure. And he said to me, don't you think we should try to do something, try to address in some small way the gap that we see here? And I remember nodding reluctantly because I knew deep down that even though I'd been in Haiti for months by then and thought I had taken it all in, I was seeing something for the first time. A vista that would become a photograph in my mind, one that I would return to again and again. So when I left Haiti and came back to England, I continued to correspond with Paul and raised a bit of money, but didn't really have a plan. I remember at times thinking about how little I could do for any one person in a country like Haiti, particularly with no real skills. I was sure it would be impossible to make a dent. I started to wonder about drama school again, until I decided that the only way to respond to the suffering I had seen was to study medicine. I went back to London to begin pre-med studies and continued to correspond with Paul, raising money for what we had loosely started calling the project. We bought equipment for weighing infants and made plans to return to Haiti as soon as classes were over. I moved to Boston to be nearer to Paul and the project and transferred to Wellesley College, continuing at the time with pre-med. telling myself it's the only way to respond to a medical crisis in the world. When I returned to Haiti during school breaks, I was part of a group conducting the census that Paul had urged us to do, going from hut to hut over a large rural area and asking questions about the conditions and what was needed in the community. The collective answer was clear: a source of clean water, drinking water, and a clinic. It's an ironic story, really, because this is a community surrounded by water. The village was once part of a fertile valley, the sort of place I had just studied in geography class, with a river and tropical ecology, crops and subsistence farmers. But in 1956, the Haitian government, led by Papa Doc Duvalier, teamed up with a large engineering firm based in Texas. And I guess it won't surprise you to know that that firm, Kellogg Brown and Root, is the very one that is run by, or used to be run by our vice president. And the company was to design and construct what was then the largest hydroelectric dam in the Western Hemisphere. Its function was to provide the capital city, Port-au-Prince, with electricity. To create the body of water for the dam to hold back, a massive valley was flooded. A whole community of people was displaced, and this set off a chain of events which led to the community's impoverishment. I remember when I was conducting the health census in 1984, I met with people who told me in great detail about the land flooding, their land flooding, and they spoke of the time avant l'eau, literally before the flood. This was a catastrophe of biblical proportions, and it created the conditions that led to increased mortality and suffering on so many levels. One of the people I spoke with was an old man in 1984, and he told me of having to choose between a goat or a pig, or which of his possessions he would run up the hillside with, as the water came bursting through the valley. None of this is to knock large-scale engineering projects. I know that plenty of work has been done in different countries to bring these fruits of modern technology to communities, but this wasn't a well-thought-out project. And to compound the problem, silting over the last 40 years has caused the dam to be almost ineffective, and the results for thousands and thousands of villages was disastrous. Their valley had been flooded. It was a long trek down thousands of vertical feet to obtain drinking water from the man-made lake. Villagers tried to make the trail, and when they went down, they filled up dried calabash gourds with drinking water and carried them back up to their huts, where they sat in shady corners, still and warm, a perfect petri dish for bacteria. Hundreds of infants and children in this small community died of dehydration from diarrheal disease in the early 80s. For want of clean water. So one response to this epidemic of diarrhea is to have oral rehydration salts shipped in. Another is to fix the water supply. We contacted a company in South Carolina, a group of engineers, and told them about the problem. They asked all the pertinent engineering type questions about the geology of the land, etc. But most heartening was their response that said, "We'll find a way, we'll be there." And they did. The engineers found a spring, a source as it's known in Haiti, and installed a pump that uses the force of water as it pushes through the ground to power it up a system of pipes all the way up the steep hillside, where it splits into 4 separate standpipes in the village, a constant supply of running water that the community uses for bathing and drinking. Infant deaths due to diarrheal disease disappeared overnight. That was my introduction to public health. As this was going on in Haiti, so a parallel operation was going on in Boston. We formed the organization officially in 1987, and we called it Partners in Health. We hoped then that there would be many partners involved in this effort. We started to bring on a number of local folks, and we found an amazing fellow called Tom White, who was financing the dream, and many others who gave their time and money and ideas and skills. And we broadened the staff in Haiti too, construction workers and teachers, nurses and community health workers. We had, in response to the community census and dearth of medical facilities in rural Haiti, started to build a clinic. And slowly, PIH began to take up more and more of my time, and I decided to switch from pre-med to English literature, mystifying my parents. Why you would leave England, where education is free, to go to America, where you pay to study English literature. But I knew then that perhaps I could be more useful in this endeavor, helping to build infrastructure, of the organization. I didn't have a plan for how to do this. I learned as I went along. We didn't set out to change the world in any way. We set out to do one thing, to serve a small community that had been displaced by a dam. As people started coming to the clinic, first a trickle and then in droves, we realized that their health wasn't simply about what we all refer to as primary care or access to medicines. A colleague of mine, a fellow who started off as an assistant at Partners in Health and has recently finished his residency, describes how jarring it was to have had a great deal of training at Harvard Medical School, to feel equipped with new knowledge, which you want to put to the test in Haiti. So you begin in Haiti to take a medical history. And the patient who sits in front of you is a landless peasant. And when you ask her what brings her to the clinic, she says, "I'm hungry. I have no money to send my children to school." That's when we realized that the right to food and housing is intimately linked to the right to health. When we started PIH, it was with a whisper. AIDS was just rearing its ugly head. At the time, in the mid-'80s, we went to a close family friend of mine, a successful management consultant who advises major corporations, and at one time the World Bank. And our friend sat down with Paul and with me and a few others, and he chatted with us about our plan to bring healthcare to a rural community in Haiti. He looked at our figures and our funding, which was essentially from one major source. He was polite, but privately later he said to me, "It can't be done. You can't bring healthcare to an entire community and expect to sustain it with donations from people who've never been to Haiti, who don't see Haitian people. It's a nice idea, but it won't last." We didn't set out to prove him wrong. We simply started the work as a band of like-minded people who were focused on the same thing, to bring medicine and healthcare to a group of people who had none. That is as specific as it got. It wasn't to right a wrong. It certainly wasn't to alter government policy or to forge alliances with corporations. It was definitely not to tussle with pharmaceutical companies, nor ministries of health. In fact, at the time, I think that we felt including these groups would complicate the mission, a mission that was focused like a laser on the patients and their outcomes. But as the patients and their ailments broadened, so did our focus. And soon, we were invited to another country, Peru. The mission, however, stayed the same, to keep bringing the fruits of modern medical science to those who need it. We didn't have a recipe, although if you ask the people
with work what the ingredients are, you'll get roughly the same answers. Compassion, imagine, humor, optimism, love, and access to resources, of course. But the news is good, because none of these ingredients are in short supply, certainly not here. If we needed oil or fossil fuels as the main components of this work, we're in trouble. From our mothership in Haiti, we expanded to Boston and we opened outposts in Mexico and Russia, sticking to the same organizing principles, finding the best way to keep our collective eye and mind on the patients and listening carefully to their list of ailments. At some point, although none of us can quite point out when, we slowly started reaching out to new partners, drug companies, executives of corporations, and presidents of hospitals, as well as ministers of health and foundations. And recently, after many years, we've stopped hearing a chorus of "this can't be done." You can't treat everybody because it's too expensive or too difficult to get medicine to people in resource-poor settings. I think that the project that began with a whisper has become a shout, but it's a collective shout. Hundreds of partners building momentum, the patients and the community health workers, NGOs, hospitals, medical schools, and some politicians and people like you. People who think it unseemly, even intolerable, to live in a world where the disparities are so glaring, where a few dollars will decide whether you or your children will live or die on any given day. And it's in this spirit that we started a project in Rwanda at the behest of the government and with a new partner, which is the Clinton Foundation HIV/AIDS Initiative. We've gone to Rwanda with a model
a model for treating HIV that was built and honed by our co-workers in Haiti and brought to Boston, where we have a program for folks who failed treatment in Boston City. I like that irony, a successful medical intervention discovered in Haiti and brought to Harvard. And the same model was adapted to a project in Peru that I mentioned earlier to treat patients with drug-resistant tuberculosis. The foundation of this model is a cadre of community health workers who, after being trained, make daily visits to the patients. They deliver not just the medicines, but a daily dose of something we call accompaniment. In fact, in Haiti, the community health workers call themselves accompagnateurs, because, as they have said so eloquently, everyone needs to be accompanied during difficult times. And what could be tougher than living with full-blown HIV disease in the setting of poverty? They check in with the patients every day. They live in the community and will know if the patient is having a hard time or doesn't have food or lives in a wretched house. It's the community health workers who will advise the patient to go to the hospital when they are sick or to look out to see if they have any food. It's a lot of work, especially in rural areas where houses are often spread out and hard to reach, which is why, if we want to tackle epidemics or chronic disease in places where disease and poverty thrives, then it can't be done by doctors and nurses alone, because there just aren't enough. It needs to be community-based, and it also is why the community health workers need to be paid. It's a job, after all. And in places characterized by poverty, providing jobs can only help the situation. But back to Rwanda, where we have recently begun working. After we were invited to bring the PIH model of care to an area of eastern Rwanda, we made a visit there last year. And we found a shell of a hospital with almost no patients, no medicines, no staff to speak of, just the district health commissioner, who is also a nurse, sitting rather disconsolately on the steps outside the hospital. I was also haunted by images from the country, a country that experienced a genocide only a decade ago, and whose physical and emotional reminder is always present, a reminder of how we failed to respond to a human rights crisis. And to heap insult upon insult, the fact that rape was used as a weapon during the genocide, leaving hundreds of thousands of women infected with HIV, just compounds it all. You only have to sit in the hut of one orphan-headed household to know that the effects of the AIDS epidemic will echo across generations of Africans and many others. We made plans to bring our colleagues from Haiti to Rwanda and teach some of what had been learned from years of treating people with AIDS in Haiti. We recruited community health workers to deliver the medicines and to thousands of patients, and we were determined to show that you can't just treat one disease in a setting where there is no primary care. Indeed, not much of anything. So we raised the funds and we refurbished the hospital. We built a lab and an operating room, put in internet access and trained nurses and community health workers. We hired builders and to start work on a pediatric ward, and we began a women's health program. We opened bank accounts and registered as an NGO. I even signed an MOU with the Rwandan Ministry of Health. And last week, I was able to go back and see the progress. And let me tell you that the best part of doing this work is seeing what can be done in settings of poverty to alter the lives of those who have been so shafted by circumstance. Over 1,000 patients are already on antiretroviral treatment, and a full and bustling hospital is there, and jobs now for 500 community healthcare workers. And I suppose more gratifying than that is the idea that PIH is not a one-off organization headed by a visionary, slightly crazy guy, although he is a visionary, slightly crazy guy, but rather a group of people who got together to find solutions to a problem, and that in doing so, they may have created a model of healthcare that could be used in other settings of great poverty. Sometimes it's hard to categorize what Partners in Health does. I like to say that it does whatever it takes to make people well. It addresses health in the broadest possible sense. In other words, we don't think of Partners in Health as strictly a medical organization, which is why we started giving broader answers to questions from funders about the work of Partners in Health. We're constantly pushing against a collective need to narrow things down, to concentrate on one disease, say, or one issue. like AIDS or TB, but rather we try to address the conditions that cause them to be vulnerable to AIDS or TB or to chronic hunger, so that when our patients tell us that their huts are falling down or that they have no roof and that during the rainy season they sleep standing up, leaning against the mud-caked wall because there is so much water on their dirt floor. We started a housing program to fund the rebuilding of houses, ones with concrete floors and tin roofs. This will do as much to improve the health of patients as pure medicine and antibiotics. What does it mean to practice medicine in the broadest possible sense? Fixing the water may seem obvious to you, as we did when the dam was built. But when we applied for a government grant to pay for antiretroviral therapies for patients, we included in the budget a small line item, and I mean small, about $3,000 to drill a well for drinking water, for the patients to take their pills. The general consensus from the grant officials was that they would prefer to send down bottled water. That is not simply bureaucracy, but a fundamental lack of imagination, and it will be the end of us all. For us at Partners in Health, things changed quickly. 2 years ago, we were arguing with policymakers about whether it was possible to treat patients in resource-poor settings, and now we're disputing whether food is a legitimate line item in a budget where people are starving. We keep learning these lessons. When Paul and I went to Western Kenya last year, we visited a treatment project for people with HIV, providing antiretrovirals to patients. They were pleased with the way things were going because the patients really were getting their meds free, but that was only half the battle. We were excited for them, and we visited a few of the patients. One woman in her 30s who was providing care for 13 orphans in her house. She was lying on a tattered sofa when we knocked. She seemed sick, wasting in spite of the antiretroviral therapies she'd been taking for months. And Paul, who's a physician, sat down and talked to her, and he asked her how things were going. And she said she didn't feel well. She had no strength. Paul asked her what she'd eaten that day. Nothing, she replied. And yesterday, nothing, she replied. The children are fed a meal at school, and I don't have anything to eat. Those children were about to become triple orphans themselves. They'd lost both of their parents, and they were about to lose also their caregiver, just to add to that. But we translated that to the organizations providing HIV care for people who have no food, and we translated it to the policymakers and ministers who make distasteful decisions about whether food for those living in poverty is a reasonable addition to a budget. I am certain that most of you are translators too, in much of what you do, whether as students or professors, or to your patients if you have them, or indeed to your children. But I am also convinced that the most important ingredient for anyone who becomes engaged in this work is imagination. A great deal of what we do is influenced by our ability to imagine a different outcome. And if you'll permit me, I'm going to take a slight sidetrack and just say that in terms of imagination, I was lucky enough to grow up with a dad who had a wonderful imagination, who wrote stories for a living. His imagination seemed limitless to me, and I'm convinced that it was his ability to imagine that helped him find solutions for some very difficult problems in his life. He was a writer, mostly of children's books, but his creativity was not limited to fiction. When my brother was injured as an infant in a road accident, the damage caused the cerebrospinal fluid to accumulate in his brain, causing swelling, and that condition is called hydrocephalus. It can cause supple skulls in children to grow disproportionately large. And this was in 1960. And the devices they used then for diverting the fluid away from the brain were called shunts, and they weren't very effective. And my brother kept having seizures and going blind. He had about 8 operations in 2 years as a 6-month-old. My father was entirely dissatisfied with the invention and kept going back to neurosurgeons to find out more about the brain and what the problem was, and he set about finding someone who could help him invent a new shunt. He said that he remembered a device from his fighter pilot days. The Hurricane aeroplane that he flew had a device that whisked the water away from the windshield as he was flying, and he put his mind to finding out how that worked so well. He found an engineer, one who specialized in the design and manufacture of small precision pumps, and together with a neurosurgeon, they designed a new hydrocephalic shunt, one that relied less on differential pressure and one that worked, and my brother never had another seizure again. Many years later, I found an article in The Lancet about the invention, and I found out that when it was shown to work, they insisted on donating the patent to Great Ormond Street Hospital for sick children in London. And I'm told that the Wade, Till and Dahl shunt was used in hydrocephalic children for years. And the reason I'm telling you that story is because I want to urge all of you in some way to remember to not feel the constraints of whatever it is your profession is whenever you can. Because for me, not feeling the constraints of my profession is the greatest luxury I have. To be able to employ my imagination every day to find solutions is, without question, a rewarding thing. I've begun to think of imagination not necessity, actually, as the mother of invention. For is it not a great failure of imagination that allows us to turn away from the problems of the world, deemed too enormous or too complicated to deal with? Imagination will lead us to realize the plethora of connections between us and the rest of the world, between our lives and that of a Haitian peasant, between us and that of a drug addict who has contracted TB in a Russian prison, between us and those living without water or vital pieces of medical machinery, blood count machines and vaccinations, and this will surely lead to ways in which we can improve the world. If I felt at the time the times that we're living in are any less exciting than those years before the Second World War when my father came of age, I feel differently now. And you don't have to be involved in a medical non-profit to see the layers of injustices heaped upon those who are least able to resist them. I think if Martin Luther King were alive today, his dream would continue to focus on equity and also on health as a human right. I think he would agitate for a movement, a real human rights movement with health at its heart. Health in the broadest sense, because it's impossible to separate health and human rights. Whether it's the right to housing, the right to food or water, the right to life-saving medicine, or the right not to be tortured. I, for one, feel a groundswell of interest from students and supporters of this work. I see journalists beginning to question, ex-Supreme Court justices speaking out, soldiers in Europe resigning in numbers from the war in Iraq. I hope this signals the beginning of a movement in which millions of people become mobilized to stand up and in many different ways make it clear that we can't live in a world where so much is available to so few. To close, I'd like to read you a quote from a physician called Jonathan Mann, who was a brilliant pioneer of AIDS treatment early on in the crisis. He was sadly killed in a plane crash on his way to Geneva, no doubt trying to convince policymakers that 6 million people dying each year from a treatable disease is not acceptable. As a pioneering advocate on a broad scale, he inspired many of us working in the field of health and human rights. And he understood in a visionary way just how our lives are so intimately connected. And he wrote, "And when the history of AIDS and of our time is written, this may well be our most important contribution, that we resisted the temptation to be lulled into complacency, that we chose instead to prevail by expressing through our work, our belief, our spiritual conviction, that our lives have meaning, that we are connected to each other and within a larger world, that we can make a difference, and ultimately that we are all worthy and equal carriers of the spark of life itself." Thank you very much for listening. Do you want me to take questions?
I have to figure out how to do the microphone business here. And if you'll just raise your hands.
You touched several times on the border of let's say, negotiations with governments.
Yes.
Now, from my knowledge, I would assume that Haiti is possibly the least stable of any place you've been. And yet it sounds like your organization is well established and perhaps not have at least government interference. And yet, well, anyway, can you speak on government?
Yeah. Well, we've been in Haiti for the longest, as I mentioned, and when we were there, we first arrived in Haiti under a dictatorship, and we've been there under many, many, many changes of government, from dictators to military juntas, to interim governments, to de facto leaders, and most of the time they haven't gotten in the way. The only government that was actually able to help us as best they could was the first democratically elected government, and that was led by President Aristide, who was ousted a couple of years ago. So that was a very big blow to us, and I know to many millions of Haitian people. So working in Haiti, we have actually found ways to, I think, circumnavigate the bad parts of the government. They've left us alone. I think they found out that we were treating people, and in some sense that was good because it let them off the hook a bit. Since then, though, what we've tried to do is actually realize the importance between not just being a separate NGO that's working on its own, but if we can team up with governments and ministries of health to beef up the public health infrastructure, that's better. And we started to do that under the Aristide government, and we've been able to continue to do it by broadening out to clinics around the area that we're working, public health clinics. So they belong to the government, and we help to refurbish them and to provide medicines and staff.
Well, I'm thinking of other governments, like Kenya. I'm a little bit aware that you would probably be running into, let's say, some government monopolies on food and so forth.
Yeah. Definitely. We actually don't work in Kenya. We were visiting Kenya, a project there at the behest of some friends of Partners in Health, and we were trying to advise them on some things. So we don't work in Kenya, and I think that would be a very difficult place to work for those reasons. We do work in Rwanda, and we've had only a terrific amount of political will and support from the government there. So on the whole, we probably the trickiest place we had to work in terms of governments was actually Peru, because we were working there, even though it was a democratically elected government, we were working there with a major epidemic that they didn't want to recognize. So we had to be incredibly diplomatic about how we went about this, and worked within the government, with the government, and with different partners there to make sure that we made the treatment for drug-resistant tuberculosis available. But it was tricky. But no, so far we haven't had to, we've steered clear, but we try to partner with governments when possible. But in terms of, if you're trying to get at things like monopolies and difficult situations where, money is being sidetracked to certain areas, we have, as an NGO, managed to keep our money quite separate from the government side of things. So, we're a non-profit NGO. We have separate bank accounts. We bring it to the countries, and then we employ people directly from there. So we're lucky. Sure.
I was wondering if I don't know how hard of a question this is, but if you could talk a little bit about any kind of trade-off that you might see between the efficacy of super sort of centralized distribution of provision of healthcare resources and how you started. I'm guessing it's sort of a small scale kind of piercing ability to get right to the community that you want to. Do you see a trade-off in efficacy of provision of resources between those?
Not really. What sort of a trade-off in terms of? Can you be a bit more specific?
I guess I'm thinking of the slowness of bureaucracy and the kind of solutions they think of.
I see. I mean, again, specifically with Partners in Health, you mean? Because we haven't become a sort of super structure. We will fight forever to become, so that we don't become a bureaucracy. One of the things that we've always sort of prided ourselves on is our nimbleness. our ability to respond to different crises. And that's why we mustn't sort of get entrenched with, other large-scale institutions, even though, as you all know, and many of you here know, that universities tend to move slowly and make decisions slowly, and so do governments, and so do other sort of large, the larger you are, that will happen. I think that what we've tried to do is to make sure that the governing structure of Partners in Health remains nimble enough, and that what we struggle to do is keep a supply of resources coming in so that we can respond quickly to the crisis, or any crisis, or the ongoing chronic conditions. One of the, we went and made our first visit to Rwanda, having been invited in there last year, and in literally 2 months we actually had the doctor who went out there to start the project before employing a number of Rwandan health workers. We had the doctor come in, and he set up a bank account. We were sending him information about how to set up a non-profit there and register as a non-profit so that we could do business as Inshuti mu Buzima, which is the Rwandan, Kinyarwanda name for Partners in Health. All of those kinds of things, we made sure that we didn't want to get stuck in some kind of, syrup or murky mire of bureaucracy. We can't do that if we're going to continue to react to these important problems.
Yep.
I'm told you didn't talk too much about how you train, what you do with your health workers in Haiti, and what types of training they have, and then what programs you found to be most successful.
Sure. One of the things that the community health worker program in Haiti is the oldest program. So actually in Haiti, we have different levels of community health workers. We have traditional birth attendants that we help to train and provide with sterile medical kits. We have a group called Agents Santé, which are just health agents who actually have quite a bit of training in them and often act as a triage between the community and between the clinics and the hospitals. And we have community health workers, or accompagnateurs, who have the least training, and actually in many cases have been able to be illiterate people. So we didn't want to put constraints on who was eligible for this work, because we really wanted it to be people within the community deciding who it was who was going to represent them, rather than sort of giving them somebody who's already literate and trained and had an education. It was likely that they wouldn't be from that person's village. So those are the three kinds of training that we do. But since the whole response to AIDS has broadened, we've brought in a curriculum to do with teaching the actual model for care. So there's a certain level of training, and over some weeks that the community health workers will get in order to know more about the disease and how to respond to it, and to integrate somewhat prevention and treatment, but really to focus quite heavily on treatment. So something to meds, treatment, and that kind of thing. Yeah, they actually hand out the meds. Yeah, the community health workers come, at different times, depending on the country, to a central place, and they will procure from the drugs warehouse a supply of the medicines, and then they will go to the patient's houses, which takes the burden off the patient coming to the clinic, which is often very difficult when someone is sick and hungry.
Hi, I want to thank you for kind of stimulating our imagination about the sorts of ways we're connected, the sorts of things we can do. One term you used and urged all of us to sort of take on this role, one role you described, that I thought was maybe a little abstract, and I'd like you to elaborate, and that's the notion of being translators. It's kind of clear how you are translators of need and in the particular context. But you spoke of how we could think of ourselves as translators, as students, faculty. So I wonder if you could be a little more concrete about maybe good examples you've seen of that kind of translational work, or what you could imagine, would really be effective things we could do in that work.
Well, I think in some ways the translation piece is somewhat abstract for me too, but I find that it happens all the time whenever I go to less so in a place like Boston, but much more so in whether I'm in Rwanda or when I'm in a place where I might be out of my element somewhat. So, if I have to go to the World Bank, I feel like I'm acting as a translator for the patients who I might have been with or lucky enough to spend time with, say, a week before, a month before, the year before. So feeling as though finding the most effective way to translate what you see to the person who could effect the most change, I guess, or who could be the most useful to you, is one way of looking at this. I think it's different if you're translating the world, say, for your children or something like that. But it is a somewhat abstract notion, and I think it's probably a personal one as well. But it certainly happens. I think there's a difference between. I was talking to some students this morning. And I think there's a difference between bearing witness, and which is important, and bearing witness and doing something about what you've seen. So, and I think that's obviously going to be a personal decision for sort of people. But I think that the notion of seeing somebody whose humanity you have to find a way to address and translate to all of the rest of the people in the worlds that we all inhabit, and make them seem just as equal as you and me. And I think that's probably one of the problems that I see as very serious in the world today, that it's some place along the way we lost the ability to see other people who are not like us or not in our world or not in our country or whatever it is as somehow less important, less human. So that I'm always astounded when I hear about you hear about some tragedy somewhere in the world and it says a plane crash or a train crash and they say 3 Americans were killed, as though that's what matters. It's like there's only 3 humans that were killed or something. And I think that it's absolutely imperative that we find a way to negotiate our way through this, to try to bring everyone back. And I think that the way to do that is by being kind of handy translators. And it might be by telling stories, it might be by doing other things. But I do think that for me, the thing that stood out, particularly as I don't speak a number of the languages in the places where we have projects. I don't speak Russian, and I don't speak Spanish fluently, and I don't speak Kinyarwanda. And here I am all the time relying on these different wonderful translators to tell me about what's wrong or what ails them or what the challenges are. And it seems like a sort of important thing. The whole notion when I see. This happens when I see, when I'm watching footage of what goes on at the UN, and you see all of these people around a thing, and they're all wearing these magical headphones that are translating the language into the language they need to hear. And yet I'm still thinking, and yet they're all speaking a different language sometimes, even though they've got these things that are translating it for them. So I'm still sort of thinking about it myself in terms of what this means as translators. I don't know.
You touched upon the issues of negotiating with industries and also intellectual property issues when your father handed over the patenting rights to a hospital. It's one of these things where so many governments, when they do give support, tend to be, they lead to large transfer of wealth from the public to the private sector, billions of dollars going to a pharmaceutical company. How do you negotiate these things when you're looking at providing health care in the developing world?
Very carefully. Very carefully. I think, I learned a lot about this from my close colleague and co-founder of Partners in Health, Jim Kim, who Tracy Kidder writes a bit about in the book. But he, one of the ways, when we went to Peru to begin with, and we started working with a number of patients there who had, we found out, drug-resistant tuberculosis, and we started looking at treating these patients, and we looked at the prices of the drugs. And the prices of the drugs were around about between $10,000 and $15,000 or more per patient for a 2-year course, which would lead to a total cure. And while I am guessing that would be a bargain to most of your parents and families to keep you alive for $15,000, it was a huge, huge, huge amount, obviously, for anyone in a place, in an urban slum in Peru, or indeed for a non-profit that was scrounging around for money as we were. But we did scrounge around for money for a while, and we got a number of patients on it. But after a while, Jim Kim, who was a physician there, and who'd also done some work when he was doing his medical anthropology PhD, he did some work on pharmaceutical companies, and he nosed around and he said, why are these drugs still on patent? They should be off patent, actually, because they were second-line drugs. And instead of making a stink about it, which is probably what I would have done, he knew how to approach the pharmaceutical companies, and he pulled them in, and he talked to them, and he took them to Peru, and he introduced them to patients, and he knew about, cajoling and bringing people on as partners. And I think that although it's important to stand up and protest in many circumstances, I also think it's important to learn who can be valuable partners and how and why they might want to be brought in. So the actual reduction of the prices and the bringing off patent of a number of these tuberculosis drugs was done very thoughtfully, and it led to some negotiations and forming something called the Green Light Committee, which is a big consortium, a group of countries that or people that approve certain drugs that are off patent, and they've been allowed to bypass the TRIPS agreement as a result of it. Brazil, probably, as you know, was the first country to say, to hell with it, to hell with TRIPS. We're going to provide universal access and free treatment for everybody who has HIV, and they have 168,000 people on treatment as a result of it. Now they were punished for that by the US, and there was a lot of problems, but they've gotten around it, and I think that now they're seen as a bit of a model, because they said, if there is a disease that's killing an enormous amount of people and we have a treatment, we are not going to go through a trade agreement in order to provide the treatment. So I think it happens in a number of different ways. I think I may be wrong on this and someone can correct me, but I think the polio vaccine, when it was developed, was given. I was thrilled to see that my dad and the other folks who'd worked on the shunt had given the patent, because there needs to be some sense that once you invent things, provide things, that they need to be there for the public good. You can't, the tension between trying to encourage people to make profits and find cures for AIDS and everything else, the rewards have to be linked to the good of stopping people from dying. But I'm not sure that we've made that connection yet. I don't know, maybe some of you can make that connection.
In terms of your HIV initiative that you were part of,
yeah,
how important and effective do you think the non-medical attention that the patients received was to their quality of life and even length of life as compared to those who only received the antiretroviral medications alone?
Yeah, I think it's actually the key. I think it's one of the main ingredients is because when you provide antiretrovirals, they were certainly in the beginning extremely harsh drugs to take. They also make you very hungry. Most people who have advanced stage AIDS are extremely gaunt, and they need a lot of calories to feel better. And they're very difficult meds to take on an empty stomach. And in fact, a number of patients couldn't take them on an empty stomach. So providing things like food or finding ways to work, on food issues and agriculture, and making sure that people who are living in terrible conditions, they're just not going to get well. So integrating that, we call it the Program for Social and Economic Rights, and it's a separate program at Partners in Health, and a lot of people have been very interested in it, because when you provide water and housing and even education, send their kids to school, you're starting what Paul Farmer refers to as a virtuous social cycle. You're injecting money into and resources and houses into a community who will thrive on those resources. So I think it's I think it's key. I really do. I think you can, there are plenty of treatment projects around the world that you see where they only provide the ARVs. And I think many people have benefited from them. I really do. I think hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, millions of people have benefited from them. But do I think do I think that more people benefit and for a longer extent because of the extra bits that are done? I think yes, definitely.
You had talked about, you talked about how you've intervened in these communities, and a lot of these communities are in countries that, at least I recognize as, I don't know if you're familiar with the work, but Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, he talks about these societies being ones that have fully and on collapsed in his, and a lot of times he contributes it to like not economic forces, environmental and lack of resources. My question though would be, to what extent do you see like a recovery from this collapse in these communities? Are they the ones that you've been involved in? Do you see them recovering and maybe being able to eventually not need the intervention from organizations like yours, at least to the extent that you are now?
Sure.
Because obviously they're not going to be producing the drugs that you provide and stuff. So.
I think that would be ideal, which is, that to be able to provide, in a sense, seed money to be able to help communities along and then be able to step back. I think that would be a very good thing. I think that I haven't read Collapse, but I think that a lot of the communities that we're talking about, countries we're talking about, have been engaged, have collapsed because of, in some cases, hundreds of years of exploitation, intervention, all historical processes that have undermined the prospering of the country. Now, I don't know what Jared Diamond says. He might counter that, but that's my experience in reading a lot about the histories of the countries where economies have collapsed. They haven't collapsed because people were lazy or because people couldn't be bothered to keep their economies going. They've collapsed because very specific forces have intervened to, from slavery onwards, to take the riches of certain nations and build up other nations as a result. So when you start with something like that, and then you watch the slow impoverishment of a country, it's important to make sure that, or to hope that the country will stand up on its feet. But I think that hundreds of years of impoverishment is going to require more than 2 years of financial aid from an NGO. So, yes, to the answer to your question, I would like to see that, and I think that one of the hopes in terms of providing the model part of Partners in Health would be to be able to, take pieces of it, not have to do the full Monty that we've done in Haiti in all of these different sites, to be able to provide some kind of really kind of enforced technical assistance and help without necessarily going in there for millions of dollars for millions of years.
We have a couple from this side.
Yeah, I would like to thank you for the inspirational speech, and I think you're doing God's work in Haiti. I'd just like to know, I was curious about the role of drug companies, and I was wondering, what are their, obviously they are donating medicines and all that stuff, but are there any...
Not that much.
Okay. So are there any clinical trials? Are there any different motives of the drug companies to get involved in your project? Have you found anything like that?
Well, we haven't really encouraged clinical trials at our projects because we feel squeamish about using people in developing countries to try out drugs. And I'm not suggesting that that's what you thought, but we have been approached by a number of different companies about doing clinical trials at our projects. So what we prefer to do is actually wait till that their efficacy is proven and say and persuade them that it's a good idea to be able to make their drugs available at a better cost. Now, the whole generics issue is an interesting one, and it's something that Partners in Health has gotten involved with. We actually get many of our drugs from a company based in India called Cipla, and Cipla, and then through them, an enormous drugs company, non-profit, based in the Netherlands, called IDA, the International Dispensary Association, I think. It buys, before we were getting it from through the Green Light Committee, the IDA used to buy it in huge quantities, which meant that they could get it at great discount. And then we would buy it at great discount from them. So we're still finding ways to work with drug companies. There's no question there's a change in some drug companies, although, you know, the profits for drug companies, they're major corporations, and they're interested in profits, which is understandable. I just wish that they could, you know, if they want to make Viagra and Allegra and, you know, Ventolin and all of those things, you know, make people who need them and can pay for them, and then, but you can't withhold drugs that are going to save people's lives because they can't pay for them. And I think that's something we have to work on.
I was going to ask you, like, do you think Haiti healthcare has improved in the past few years?
Do I think the healthcare in Haiti?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it headed in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've teamed up with a number of other groups in Haiti, so that there are other groups treating specifically, say, AIDS. But
Before, in the last couple of years, before President Aristide was ousted, there was money coming into the country to be able to actually help with the healthcare situation there. So it's very difficult to build a healthcare system on poverty, on nothing, with no money whatsoever. So a lot of the money that's coming into Haiti, or was coming into Haiti, was from, you know, NGOs, and right now the U.S. government is sending money through NGOs, and I heard it was also it had ceased its punishing embargo, and actually was sending money down to the interim de facto government.
Here's one from the middle.
I can't keep track of these governments.
One from the middle.
Hi, I guess I just was looking for some insight more about pharmaceutical companies and dealing with them in this country. And I know in other places it's a little bit different, but I know in a lot of resource poor settings in which you aren't able to pay for their drugs, you often give them free samples. And that's kind of using what the pharmaceutical company presents as charity almost. How do you feel that using those versus kind of trying to get away from the pharmaceutical company monopoly in other ways?
So the question is, how do I feel about them sort of using ways to sort of give out free samples and charity versus finding a way
available in general?
Well, I think charity is good. I'm not against charity, but I do think that there are, you know, hopefully there would be sort of longer term solutions. But I think that it's important, you know, I don't know the reasons I don't know enough about the pharmaceutical industry, to tell you the truth, to sort of really pinpoint the answer to that. But I think that pharmaceutical companies give out free samples for a number of reasons. I imagine, you know, in part so that there's name recognition and they can get people in, you know, if you start giving out free samples of, you know, Motrin versus, you know, ordinary ibuprofen, people will start looking on the shelves for Motrin and they, you know, recognize it. So I think there's probably a number of reasons to do that. But drug companies in general giving out meds, they do, but not in the kinds of quantities that they're needed, or certainly even just from our relatively small organization. So we've had some luck getting occasional drug company to give us treatment for what's known as you know, orphan drugs for very, very obscure diseases where the people in, you know, a country somewhere could not possibly get. So we can get those kinds of donations. We haven't had a lot donated for, you know, some of the major TB and AIDS drugs. You know, one of the problems with treating pediatric AIDS at the moment in the world is that because there is almost no pediatric AIDS in the United States, none. I mean, 300 cases, I think, last year, the whole United States. The reason why is because the mothers are treated in this country. So it's not passed on to the children, to say nothing of the fact that the mothers also stay alive, which is a good thing. But as a result, there's no pediatric AIDS dosing for medicine. So for people working in developing countries trying to find pediatric AIDS medicine, it's been a barrier for some doctors and people, and wanting to give medicine to children because it's not dosed properly, and they're worried about overdosing kids and all kinds of things like that. So there's a number of different things. I don't think I've answered your question very well. Do you need to, can you pinpoint it a bit more?
Kind of as a manipulation of the system. Is there a way to work around using their mirage?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the same way that sort of one works around any system. You manipulate right back, and you cajole, and you try to make contacts within it. You try to affect change at a policy level. So, one of the things that you definitely, something we didn't do at Partners in Health for a long time was to actually go to politicians. You try to get champions who can, support what it is you do. We've gone with a politician or two to one of our sites. We're shameless when it comes to trying to get people on board this kind of effort, because I think that, a lot of the time, a lot of even politicians here who might have connections to, or could affect change at a policy level, have no idea what's going on in these different places. So I would say, yeah, there's definitely ways. Political level, corporate level, going in, but all of this work, all of it, which won't be a surprise to many of you, is all about connections and relationships. The whole thing, who you know, where, who you spend time with, donors, politicians, policymakers, that's why it's important not to make too many enemies in this work, because there's some very powerful people around, and it's much, much better to bring people on into a movement than to alienate them.
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, if I could.
Sure.
In the book, Mountains Beyond Mountains, and also in one of the articles that I don't know if everybody has seen them or they're posted on the Rock website or something, you talk about some horrific cases of very complicated diseases like cancers. At least in one story,
Yes.
Paul, and you must have been involved, got someone flown to Boston for some exotic treatment.
Yeah.
And what you've talked about so far today has been mostly sort of ongoing treatments. What about these late onset or really difficult diseases like cancers and other things? Are they only for demonstration cases, or can something regular be done for those?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think without question something regular can be done for those. I think that most of AIDS has gotten a lot of sort of burst of attention because it's it's an important and exotic and frightening disease. It's exotic because most of us now, at this point, won't be touched by it because we're lucky enough to be in a position where we don't have to be put at risk in the same way that many other people do. But I think that there are, for example, using the community health workers to deliver care for the much less exotic diseases, chronic diseases like diabetes and cancer and various things that can be controlled and can be treated. It's not that complicated. It can be complicated to have radiation therapy in a place like Haiti, but it's not complicated to have an operation. It's not complicated to deliver chemotherapy. So I would say, although the case that you're referring to with the fellow who had a brain tumor, that was definitely desperate measures and expensive desperate measures. And one of the reasons that particularly we did it for that kid is that mother had lost, this was her last kid, and she'd lost 4 children before him. So we felt that desperate measures were needed, and sadly he died in Boston. But I think there's absolutely no question that what we need to do is sort of raise our standards and say, if getting the therapy and getting the treatment and getting the medicines to patients is not that difficult.
And I'd like to ask another question. There are a lot of young people in here. And what can they do? Because you were telling us yesterday that Partners in Health can't train them all. You don't have internships for anybody, but you've given a very inspirational talk. What can people do?
Well, I think there's an awful lot that people can do, and I know that there's people here who already know it, some of whom I've spoken to today. But I think that more than ever that you can start on the political level here in this country. I think knowing very much that who's president in this country right here and now, although we might have specific opinions about it, it's not going to affect whether or not we eat or whether or not we get medical care. It will affect a number of people's lives. But who is president of the United States will certainly affect who lives and dies in many places in the world. So I would say the first thing to do would be to get political, to start, working towards change, if that's what you believe, depending on where your political persuasions lie. Of course, I'm being presumptuous here, but work on the things that you believe in, and know that it's a small group of people that have always and often tended to effect change in this country, and then I would say stay really, really informed. The way that we get information here in this country is a sort of the stuff that lands on our doorstep, and the stuff that's on MSN when we open up the page, and the stuff that's on Fox News is not necessarily the real story. That won't surprise many of you. But so look a little deeper for what's going on. Make connections to the people whose lives are being very, very affected by what's going on here. Policy in this country, I mean, I hope that none of you felt I was exaggerating, but I really see a very worrying trend going on in this country, this sort of erosion of rather basic civil rights, sort of slowly before our eyes, in this kind of subtle, or as someone said to me last night, not so subtle ways. And I think it's important that we challenge it, that if that's what you believe and you feel that things aren't going very well at the moment, that people feel that they can actually, they can challenge what's going on without, if you feel that you're not going to be put in jeopardy or arrested or any of that kind of thing. But I do think that getting together, the most important thing for me, and the route I was able to choose, was that I found a group of like-minded people. And it's very difficult to do this kind of work on your own. It's at times demoralizing, like any work. And knowing that however difficult it gets for us, it's 1,000 times more difficult for the people and patients that we serve, but also knowing that I can come back and I can say, oh, you won't believe what I saw in Kenya. Let me give you, if you'll permit me, one very brief story. Do we have time? So I was also in Kenya last week, again, visiting that same group. And while we were there with some visitors, they were showing them the same voluntary counseling and testing clinic that I had seen many times before, and Paul had too. We let the visitors see it, and it was part of a public health clinic, which is a fee-for-service clinic in Kenya, and which meant that there was very few patients, even though there are a number of people who would need medical care there. And so we walked into this stone floor, dingy hospital ward, open windows, and the two patients were there, and one had an IV that was sort of hooked up to a window and makeshift. It looked in terrible condition. And then there was an old guy who I later learned was about 67 years old, and he was lying on the floor. And Paul walked up to him, and we had a community health worker with us, and he spoke Swahili, and or Luo, I think it was actually. And Paul said, "Does he have malaria?" And the community health worker spoke to him for a minute, and Paul said, "Well, tell him I'm a doctor." And the guy who was lying there groaning, sweating, pulled back the blanket that he had covering him to reveal a huge abscess on his hip and his buttock. It's just enormous. And Paul, who's an infectious disease doctor, but you certainly didn't need to be one to know what to do, said, well, this he has a terrible infection. This needs to be drained, and it needs to be done immediately. And a nurse came in, I think the only medical person that I saw there, and said, well, who's going to pay for it? And Paul said, well, we'll pay for it, but he'll need to be transported to a hospital that was close by. It was a mission hospital, but also fee for service. And while I was there and I was helping him we were trying to get him to see if he could stand, and he was groaning and moaning, and I noticed that there was blood sort of around his buttocks, but, and we found out from the nurse that he had fallen and hurt himself. So Paul thought maybe he'd broken his hip, maybe he'd broken his leg, something had happened. So he couldn't stand, he was groaning. We got some community health workers to lift the mattress and take him to the car, and we took him to the Adventist hospital. And I went off to do something with some other people and came back later. And later that evening, Paul and I were having dinner. He said, I went to the OR. He said, you will never guess what happened. He said, that guy fell into a ditch, and an 8-inch stick went into his rectum and lodged in there. And over the course of 4 or 5 days, an infection developed around it, and then it spread around his buttock, and he couldn't move, and he was in terrible pain. And he probably, maybe even himself, didn't know exactly what had happened. And he would have died of sepsis in a couple of days. A horrible, horrible death. I mean, the indignity of surviving to 67 in a place like Kenya, as a guy, as a poor man, to die because you had the misfortune of falling into a ditch and a stick penetrates your rectum. And to know that it was absolutely not possible for him to have that surgery unless someone paid for it. And these are the kinds of stories that I see and hear all the time when I go to these different places, and I think, deciding on whether you live or die based on that, it's just all wrong. It's just all wrong. So I feel like, I feel as though in bringing some of these stories to you and as you decide what I'm sure all, many of you students have infinite talents, and what it is that you do with your life, I hope that you will always keep in the back of your mind those people who are unlike most of us, really unable to fend for themselves for the moment, and to change the course of things for them.
One last question, perhaps.
I find some of these things like the Bill and Melinda Gates and immunization programs of white foundations is rather thrilling, and even our national AIDS program, except for the abstinence bit.
Yeah.
Like your comment on, outside groups that are helping, and are they?
Yeah, they are. We've had a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think that that's what I sort of meant when I feel like there's a sea change in the last few years. I mean, having done this work since the early 80s, it felt like a real struggle from the beginning to get people engaged in this, to get people to give money, to make people feel as though even foundations that were just, large, huge bureaucratic foundations that were just entrenched in their own sort of cycle of giving, or, endowments that would only give less than 5% of the 50 trillion away, whatever it was. It feels different now. So it feels to me as though, that's why I do think that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing good work, and I think Bono is too. I think anybody who takes the time and trouble to publicize and make this important work, act as translators for the rest of the world, I think it's important. They are. I mean, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are putting huge amounts of money into it. Is it all in exactly the right area? Everyone's going to have different opinions on it. Vaccine trials and all of that, finding a vaccine for AIDS is thrilling, you're right. It's very exciting. And knowing that the richest person in the world has put his lot behind global health equity issues, I think is a thrilling thing, and so it feels to me as though that there's huge momentum right now, and this is a crisis of really terrible proportions, a time that we're living in right now.
We have one more time. One more.
I was just wondering, when it came to the different communities that your organization traveled to, how did the community receive you, and in particular, healthcare workers in those communities? How did they feel, or how were they involved and whatnot?
Yeah, so we only went into areas that we were invited to. So we didn't sort of just stand up and say, oh, that place would need that place needs us. We'll go and help them. That we didn't do that. So we always had an intro in very different ways in different places. We didn't just turn up. So that was key, to be invited somewhere. And secondly, to involve the community in any of the decisions that you make, I think is absolutely imperative. So again, we didn't go in there saying, well, what we learned at the School of Public Health was that you need a latrine and that you need this. Even though all of that could be true, we said, knowing full well that they who've lived in that area for a long time would probably know best what they needed. And they often did. You know, they said, this is the amazing thing about the whole notion of educating people. They often know what it is that's the problem. You know, I remember going into a village years and years ago and saying, talking about AIDS prevention and saying, you know, do you know what causes AIDS? And you know, after a long conversation about the obvious thing that causes AIDS, they said, you know what puts us at risk to AIDS is our poverty. We're women who have absolutely no power, and we have no access to money, and we have to have sexual intercourse with these men who happen to be truck drivers because they're the ones who have money. And they taught us like that, and we said, well, of course they know that they're at risk. And what do you need to be able to get to the root of that problem? You need to educate women and provide them with jobs, or make sure that through their education they can get jobs. You need to inject economies. You need to do things like that. So that's a segue. But the community health workers and the communities have always, so far, I mean, we're not in a ton of places, have received us well, because we usually go into communities that are pretty devastated. And we don't go in with, you know, Isuzus and flying and, you know, and saying, oh, we're here, and we sort of go in very quietly and start working with community leaders and then making sure that nowadays we work with sort of, when we can, public health infrastructure, so already in the government. Community health workers were thrilled because we were giving jobs to people who really had no chance of jobs, you know, especially, we work mostly in rural areas, so it's a very different situation in the urban areas. And community health workers were happy about it so far. You know, there is probably, to raise one potential issue, you know, in some of these countries, doctors and nurses could be quite protective about the jobs that they do. Once you start saying, you know, community health workers can give out medicine and everything else, that can be undermining to some of the doctors and nurses who've been trained. But you have to find a way, knowing that the doctors and nurses cannot reach all of the patients, cannot possibly reach all of the patients, you have to find another system to be able to do it, and make sure that that the doctors and nurses are involved in the system of training the community health workers, where, you know, there's still, you're not taking jobs away from them, you're simply trying to reach more people. So community health workers are definitely trained by the doctors and the nurses. So it hasn't been, for us, it hasn't been a problem. I could see how it would be in places where doctors and nurses are really highly valued.
Our time is basically up. I have one very last question.
How many of you heard of the CVIM? Well, you see, this is a very interesting thing, because the CVIM, in Center County, there are 11,000 residents who cannot afford health treatment. They are below the poverty line, or they're beneath twice the poverty line. If that is the case, they can get free health care. The doctors, the dentists are giving their services. Individuals, there are something like 350 people volunteering to work over in the facilities. And I mention this not to compare it in any way, but to say that here in the town in which you live is going on something that epitomizes what a community should do for itself. I know. But there is one of the things, they do not take money from any agency which is tax supported, because they want no mandated regulations from bureaucrats. And it's just a very exciting kind of thing. But I bring it up because even here in this
Yes.
very affluent society of ours,
Yes.
there are pockets like this all over the country that people who want to do good can find something to do about.
Yeah. I think it's absolutely
Thank
true.
you, and thank you very much.
Thank you.